talking about, did the government of Canada meet that threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act? And really, what we're doing is, it's not a matter of whether or not you agreed with the convoy or not. It was whether or not this government or future governments can use this tool for a process like this.
Right. And, you know, Larry and I have the distinct privilege and responsibility to serve on that special joint committee with senators and members of parliament to look at that and whether the threshold was met and to ensure that no government again can invoke it under the same circumstance. And, you know, and as you look at it, the Act, the Emergencies Act had some very specific requirements. It had to meet the threshold of a national a threat to Canada's security as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And, you know, there's legal pundits, there's many people who provided evidence on this committee, and I don't believe that threshold was met. And then we've now been, since the commission, the Rouleau Commission, we've been given this new information that the government relied on a broader interpretation of the legislation. It's like, well, the law is pretty clear. Here's the defined line. As a government, you must follow the law. And they found a broader interpretation, which they say give them that authority to invoke it. However, Canadians, we haven't seen that specific legal opinion that they relied on. And I think that's problematic. Canadians deserve transparency. We haven't seen that through this process.
But didn't the government try to change the definition in their minds, kind of reread into that whole, it was there in print, but they kind of put their own spin on things. You heard Mendocino and Lametti talk about that.
As I explained to you on a previous podcast, Jamie, and thank you for your kind invitation to appear on this special show. And the purpose behind this is really to educate those Canadians, in my view, that feel that this was an occupation that had to end. Whether or not it ended lawfully, whether it ended in a dangerous setting precedent, doesn't really matter to almost 2/3 of the Canadians that are following this. Yeah. And I want them to realize that there is a greater implication of having that particular attitude. And this all goes back to the evidence that we have heard on this committee. There is nothing so far that we have reviewed, nothing that we have heard by way of testimony that it would seem to indicate that there was a legal basis for the invocation of this particular act. And that's important to me, given my legal background. Mm-hmm. And it was important, obviously, to Justice Rouleau in the commission. If you recall, when Justice David Lametti testified, he was being less than transparent. Mm-hmm. He was being less than open. And in fact, wouldn't even admit to the existence of a legal opinion. Now, this Liberal government in 2015 promised Canadians, and in fact, I remember watching Prime Minister Justin Trudeau look straight into the camera and promise Canadians that his government would be the most open and transparent and accountable government this country has ever seen. When you hide behind a legal opinion that your own lawyers were directed to provide to the government to justify the invocation of the act, and you do not supply that to Canadians in support of what legal rationale there was, is extremely troubling to me. It was troubling to the commission inquiry lawyers. It was troubling to Justice Rouleau. And in fact, it was one of the inquiry lawyers who actually put it out there in a statement in the inquiry that this is not about transparency when you hide behind a legal opinion that us Canadians don't deserve to see. A just trust us attitude does not suffice when you are dealing with the most heavy-handed, most powerful legal remedy that any government could have over its citizens. The suppression of civil rights, the suppression of the ability to be secure of unreasonable search and seizure with respect to your bank accounts and investments, the right for peaceful assembly, the right to have freedom of speech were all curtailed by this Liberal government's invocation of the Act. And you got to take a step back, in my view, Jamie, and ask yourself, take a look at all of the, all of the examples of some real life emergencies, some dangerous emergencies that this country has faced in the last close to 40 years. And no government ever used that method of last resort. We heard our Prime Minister talking. This was a tool of last resort. In our view, by lowering that legal threshold, it's no longer a method of last resort. What other current or future emergency could there be where any future government, we do not want to normalize it. In our view, it sets a very dangerous precedent.
And thank you, Larry. Well said. One of the things that this government has shown the Canadian public is they can't be trusted. And the invocation of this act under these circumstances, I think, just create further distrust and division in this country. And we need to we need to ensure that the Canadian public has trust in our institutions again, and that is not something that this act is providing comfort around to Canadians. Even we had at our last meeting several weeks ago, we had some academics who were there, and each of them said, "Listen, without seeing this broader interpretation that the government say they relied upon to understand it." They don't believe the threshold was met as defined currently in law. And that's what government's supposed to do. They're supposed to follow the law. And here in this circumstance, I'm quite troubled that, the circumstances didn't quite meet the threshold, so they developed their own. And that's what it appears. And until we see it, people are left to believe what they want. And, that is a challenge.
Yeah, to me, just looking from the outside with not the backgrounds in law enforcement and the judicial side you do, Larry, there must be a reason why they're hiding it. It must not be good, I would think, but
you can't, the Emergencies Act was never intended to be invoked because of an inconvenience. Right. Because of incompetence, no matter where that lied, because people didn't want to hear, you disagreed with a message, as Larry said at the front end, whether you agree with the convoy or not, the Emergencies Act is a measure that is last resort for the absolute security of a national threat to our country. That did not exist, in my opinion, and we haven't seen any evidence to suggest that it was.
Anything else you guys want to add before I flip over to the C-21 bill?
I think our position is very clear. We touched upon it in earlier podcasts, Jamie. I just ask Canadians just to keep an open mind, really follow this podcast, follow the work that my colleague and I, Glenn, are doing on the Emergencies Act committee. We all look forward to the release of Justice Rouleau's commission report, and that may or may not continue or allow us to continue with the work that we're doing on the committee.